Look at a photograph of a fish tank. One large fish swims in the front. Smaller fish, plants, and bubbles fill the background. Now describe what you saw. If you grew up in a Western country, you probably led with the big fish. If you grew up in an East Asian country, you probably described the whole scene, the fish and its surroundings together, as one connected picture. This isn't a coincidence. It's one of the most replicated findings in cross cultural psychology, and it reveals something stranger than a simple preference. It suggests that attention itself, the most basic act of looking at the world, is not built the same way in every human brain. You probably assume perception is universal. Look at a scene and you just see what's there. But what if the very thing you notice first, the thing your eyes are drawn to before you even think about it, depends heavily on where you were raised? Start with the man who ran that fish tank experiment. Psychologist Richard Nisbett spent years comparing how American and East Asian participants processed visual scenes. In one now famous study, he showed participants brief animated clips of underwater scenes and then asked them to recall what they'd seen. American participants overwhelmingly described the focal object first, usually the largest or fastest moving fish. Participants from Japan and other East Asian countries described the environment first, the water, the plants, the relationships between objects, often mentioning the focal fish only after setting the scene. Same video, different starting point, different mental picture entirely. Nisbet didn't stop at fish tanks. Across dozens of related studies, the same pattern kept appearing. Show people a photograph and ask them to judge whether it changed, and Westerners were faster to notice changes to a central object, while East Asian participants were faster to notice changes to the background. It wasn't that one group was more observant, it was that their attention was organized around different questions. Where is the important thing? Or how does everything here relate to everything else? So, where does a difference this fundamental come from? Not from eyesight, not from intelligence. It comes from something psychologists Hazel, Markus, and Shinobu Kitayama began mapping out in the late 1980s, a concept that reframed how psychology understood the self entirely. Markus and Kitayama proposed that people build their sense of self in one of two broad ways. An independent self-construal treats the self as a distinct, bounded individual, separate from others, defined by internal traits, personal goals, personal achievements. An interdependent self-construal treats the self as fundamentally relational, defined by connections, roles, and obligations to family, community, and group. Neither is a personality quirk. Both are deeply learned frameworks, reinforced from early childhood by language, parenting style, schooling, and the thousands of small social cues a child absorbs before they can even explain what a self is. Here's why that matters for the fish tank. If your sense of self is independent, it makes sense that your attention would default to isolating a central figure, the fish, and pull it out of its background, because that's exactly how you've learned to think about yourself. Bounded, separable, definable on its own terms. If your sense of self is interdependent, it makes sense that your attention would default to processing the whole field of relationships at once, because that's how you've learned to think about anyone, including yourself, not a separate entity, a node inside a web. This shows up far beyond lab experiments. Think about the phrase, follow your dreams. In a culture built around independent self-construal, this sounds like unquestionably good advice. Pursue what makes you individually happy. Chase your own path. But in a culture built more around interdependent self-construal, the same phrase can land very differently, sometimes read as short-sighted, even mildly alarming, because it seems to prioritize personal desire over the stability of the family or group the person belongs to. The advice isn't wrong in either culture. It's answering a different question about what a person is actually for. Now, here's the twist that makes this whole conversation stranger than it first appears. For most of the 20th century, psychology quietly assumed its Western findings simply described human nature. Study a group of American college students, publish the results, and call it How People Think. But who exactly were these college students? In 2010, researchers Joseph Henrich Stephen Heine and Aras Norenzayan published a landmark paper pointing out an uncomfortable statistical fact. The overwhelming majority of psychology's foundational research came from a narrow, unusual slice of humanity, people who were Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. They gave this group an acronym that stuck instantly: WEIRD. And when Hinrich, Heine, and Norenzayan compared weird populations to the rest of the world on measure after measure, from visual perception to fairness judgments to reasoning style, weird participants weren't typical humans at all. On many dimensions, they were outliers, some of the least representative people on the planet, and yet their responses had been quietly treated as the neutral baseline for the entire species. That single reframe changes how you should read almost every psychology finding you've ever encountered, including the fish tank study itself, which only became meaningful once researchers specifically went looking for a comparison group outside the weird sample. Without that comparison, the Western pattern of attention would have simply been recorded as the pattern, full stop, no asterisk, no cultural context attached. The differences run deeper than pictures of fish, and language offers one of the clearest examples. Some languages grammatically require the speaker to mark whether an action was intentional or accidental. English lets you say he broke the vase, whether it happened on purpose or by clumsy accident. The sentence structure doesn't force you to specify. Other languages build that distinction directly into the grammar, making it almost impossible to describe the event without immediately signaling intent. Researchers studying this kind of grammatical variation have found it can subtly shift how quickly and how strongly people assign blame. Even in cases where the actual facts of the accident are identical, the language isn't just describing thought. In small but measurable ways, it's shaping it. Put all of this together, and a picture starts to form that's more interesting than Western people think one way, Eastern people think another. What's really being revealed is that the human mind isn't running one fixed operating system with a few cosmetic cultural skins layered on top. It's running fundamentally different software, installed early, reinforced constantly, shaped by language, family structure, philosophy, and centuries of accumulated social practice, each version brilliantly adapted to answer the specific question its culture cares most about. Western frameworks, broadly speaking, tend to optimize for identifying the individual, the actor, the cause, the standalone object that can be judged, credited, or blamed on its own terms. East Asian frameworks, broadly speaking, tend to optimize for identifying the relationship, the context, the web of connections that gives any single element its actual meaning. Neither approach is more evolved. Neither is the default human setting with the other as a variation. They're two different, coherent answers to the same ancient problem every human society has to solve somehow. How do you make sense of a self surrounded by other selves? Which brings you back to that fish tank, because the picture was never really about fish at all. It was a mirror. Show it to 100 different people from 100 different backgrounds, and you're not just measuring what they see. You're measuring the invisible architecture behind their looking, the framework, learned before they could speak, that decided which part of the world deserved to be noticed first. The fish was always the same fish. It's the mind doing the looking that was never going to be the same twice.